funny, isn't it? Everyone suddenly forgot how things happened. They look at you like you're just another person standing in the room, completely harmless, completely ordinary. And somehow, every decision went exactly where you wanted it to go. They'll call it luck. They'll call it coincidence. They'll swear nobody was controlling anything. That's the beautiful part about pretending not to know. People can look straight at the truth and still choose the story that makes them feel comfortable. Because you didn't need to shout. You didn't need to threaten anyone. You didn't need to stand in the center and announce that you were 3 moves ahead. You watched. You listened. You noticed who talked too much, who reacted too quickly, who needed attention, who couldn't resist proving themselves. And while they were busy playing their little games, you started understanding the board. Now they're confused because the outcomes don't make sense to them. The people they trusted are acting differently. The plans they thought were guaranteed are falling apart. The doors they expected to open are suddenly closing, and somehow every road keeps leading back to the one person they underestimated, you. But here's what makes it uncomfortable. They know you had something to do with it. They just don't want to admit it. So they play dumb. They pretend they didn't notice your silence. They pretend they didn't notice how quickly you adapted. They pretend your patience was weakness and your distance meant you had nothing to say. They never realized that while they were trying to figure out what you were doing, you were figuring out why they were doing it. And that's where everything changed. They mistook your silence for weakness because they were measuring your power by the noise you made. That's how people think when they need everything explained to them. If you're loud, they assume you're confident. If you argue, they assume you care. If you react, they assume they have control. But when you stop giving them reactions, suddenly they have nothing to measure. And that makes them uncomfortable. You became difficult to read, and people hate what they cannot predict. They wanted you emotional because emotions are easy to manipulate. They wanted you defensive because a defensive person reveals what matters to them. They wanted you angry because anger makes people careless. But you didn't give them any of that. You just watched, quietly, patiently. And while they were busy trying to figure out why you weren't reacting, you were noticing everything they were revealing without even realizing it. They thought your silence meant you had nothing to say. No, you had too much to say, and you finally understood that not everything deserves to be spoken. There's a difference between being speechless and being selective. You learned that explaining yourself to people committed to misunderstanding you is just another way of handing them ammunition. So you stopped explaining. You stopped correcting every rumor. You stopped defending every decision. You stopped rushing to prove that you were right. And suddenly, the people who depended on your reactions started feeling strangely powerless. They had built an entire picture of you around your responses, and then you changed the rules without announcing that the rules had changed. That's the part they didn't expect. They knew the old version of you. The version that answered immediately. The version that cared what everyone thought. The version that felt the need to prove intentions, explain mistakes, and make sure everybody understood your side. They became comfortable with that version because they knew how to push him. They knew which buttons to press. They knew what words would make you angry, what accusations would make you defensive, what disrespect would make you step forward and start explaining yourself. Then one day the buttons stopped working. They pressed them. Nothing happened. They tried again. Still nothing. And now they're standing there wondering if you broke. When the truth is much simpler, you learned. You learned that not every insult requires a response. Not every accusation deserves an explanation. Not every person deserves access to your thoughts. Sometimes the strongest move is allowing someone to keep believing whatever makes them comfortable, while you continue moving in the direction you already chose. Let them think you're behind. Let them underestimate your discipline. Let them assume you're confused because you're quiet. People reveal more when they think they're winning. They become careless. They talk more. They show their priorities. They expose their insecurities. They start performing for an audience that doesn't even exist. And you You just sit there collecting information without needing to announce that you're collecting anything. That silence started bothering them because it gave them no confirmation. They couldn't tell whether you were hurt, angry, planning, moving on, or simply uninterested. And uncertainty has a funny way of creating stories inside people's heads. They started filling the silence with their own assumptions. Maybe you're scared. Maybe you're losing. Maybe you don't know what to do. Maybe you finally gave up. They kept guessing because you refused to provide the answer. Meanwhile, you were becoming more disciplined, more focused, and less dependent on outside approval. You discovered something they never expected you to discover: your attention is a currency. Stop spending it everywhere, and suddenly people realize how expensive your presence actually was. They called it weakness because they couldn't imagine strength without aggression. They thought power had to announce itself. They thought confidence had to dominate every conversation. They thought you needed to be seen winning. But real control can look incredibly boring from the outside. It can look like walking away. It can look like saying nothing. It can look like refusing to argue with someone who desperately wants an audience. It can look like letting consequences speak for you. It can look like watching someone make the same mistake for the 5th time, and finally deciding that their lesson is no longer your responsibility. And that's when the misunderstanding becomes almost amusing. They thought you were losing because you stopped playing their game. They didn't realize you had stopped needing the game at all. They were still competing for attention, approval, recognition, and the last word. You were learning how to live without any of it. They were trying to win conversations while you were changing your life. They were counting reactions while you were building results. They were studying your silence as if it were an empty space, never realizing that sometimes silence is where the real decisions are made, where the distractions disappear, where the ego gets quiet, and where a person finally learns exactly what they are capable of when nobody is clapping for them. While they were busy performing, you were watching. That was the difference they never noticed. They thought everybody in the room was playing the same game, chasing the same attention, fighting for the same approval, trying to prove the same thing. So they talked louder. They made bigger promises. They exaggerated their victories. They created little scenes, little conflicts, little moments designed to make sure all eyes stayed on them. And you stood there quietly, almost invisible to the people who only notice noise. They assumed you had nothing going on because you weren't announcing every thought that crossed your mind. They assumed you had no plan because you weren't constantly explaining your next move. That was their first mistake. They confused visibility with importance. People reveal themselves when they think nobody is paying attention. Give someone enough space, and eventually they'll show you what they fear, what they want, what they envy, and what they're willing to do to protect their image. You didn't need to interrogate anybody. You didn't need secret tricks or elaborate schemes. You just paid attention to patterns. Who changed when certain people entered the room? Who suddenly became confident when they had an audience? Who acted supportive but disappeared when things became difficult? Who laughed at your failures a little too comfortably? Who became strangely quiet whenever your progress was mentioned? While everyone else was trying to control how they looked, you were learning who they actually were. And the funny part is, they practically handed you the information themselves. Every unnecessary comment, every exaggerated reaction, every moment they tried too hard to look unbothered, every time they repeated, "I don't care," while clearly caring more than anyone else in the room. People think masks are complicated. Most of the time, they're not. A person can only perform for so long before the cracks start showing. Pressure changes the voice. Jealousy changes the eyes. Fear changes the decisions. And when someone believes you're too distracted to notice, they become even more careless. That's why your silence confused them. They were performing for you, but you weren't giving them the audience they expected. No applause, no argument, no visible anger, no desperate attempt to compete. Imagine spending all that energy trying to provoke someone and realizing they've been studying the entire performance instead. Imagine thinking you're controlling the atmosphere, because everyone can hear you, only to discover that the quiet person in the corner understood the room better than anyone else. That realization has a way of making people uncomfortable, because while they were busy trying to look powerful, you were paying attention to what power actually looked like. It wasn't the person who had to dominate every conversation. It wasn't the person who always needed to be right. It wasn't the person who collected attention like it was oxygen. Real strength often had nothing to prove. It could wait, it could observe, it could walk away from a pointless argument and still sleep peacefully that night. You started understanding that the loudest person in the room is sometimes just the most afraid of being ignored, so you let them talk, let them brag, let them create stories about themselves, let them underestimate you because you weren't competing for the spotlight. Every time they assumed you didn't understand what was happening, they relaxed. And relaxed people reveal more. They stop choosing their words carefully. They start showing their habits. They expose their priorities without meaning to. You learned more from watching what people repeatedly did than from listening to what they claimed they would do. That changed the way you moved. You stopped reacting to appearances. You stopped making decisions based on the version of people they presented to the world. You watched the difference between their words and their actions. You watched who only showed loyalty when it was convenient. You watched who respected boundaries and who treated kindness like an invitation to take more. You watched who celebrated success publicly but secretly became distant when you started improving. None of this required revenge. None of it required manipulation. Observation was enough, and while they were putting on performances, you were becoming harder to fool. That was the real transformation. You began seeing beyond the surface without becoming obsessed with everyone around you. You didn't need to chase every hidden meaning or assume every person was against you. You simply became more aware. You learned to trust patterns over promises, consistency over charm, and actions over carefully rehearsed words. You learned that people can say exactly what you want to hear while quietly showing you something completely different. They kept mistaking your observation for passivity. They thought because you didn't immediately respond, you didn't understand. Because you didn't expose every inconsistency, they assumed you hadn't noticed it. Because you allowed them to keep talking, they thought they were convincing you. But you were no longer listening just to reply. You were listening to understand. And there's a dangerous difference between those two things. Someone who listens only to respond is easy to control. Say something offensive and they react. Challenge them and they defend themselves. Praise them and they soften. Criticize them and they lose focus. But someone who watches without immediately surrendering to emotion becomes much harder to predict. They can hear an insult without allowing it to decide their next move. They can recognize a performance without needing to interrupt it. They can notice a pattern and quietly adjust their distance, their trust, and their expectations. That's what they failed to understand about you. They were busy creating an image, and you were busy understanding reality. They were trying to win moments, and you were learning from them. They were focused on being seen, while you were focused on seeing clearly. Every performance gave you another piece of the puzzle. Every reaction showed you another weakness. Every attempt to impress exposed another insecurity. And while they kept looking toward the audience for approval, you kept standing there, quiet enough to hear what nobody else was listening for, watching the masks slip one expression at a time, watching the stories change depending on who entered the room. Watching people reveal themselves through the things they thought were too small for anyone to notice. They thought they were hiding things from you, but people have a strange habit of telling the truth without saying a word. A pause that lasts too long, a smile that arrives too late, a sudden change in tone when your name comes up, a compliment that sounds more like an insult, a joke that somehow contains a little too much truth. They thought they were controlling the conversation, but their reactions were writing a second conversation underneath the first one, and you started learning how to read it. You stopped listening only to what people said and started paying attention to what happened when they said it. That's when everything became obvious. You didn't need to accuse anyone. You didn't need to corner them and demand an explanation. You simply watched what changed when pressure entered the room. People can rehearse words, but reactions are harder to rehearse. Someone can prepare a perfect speech about how happy they are for you, then watch their expression disappear when you actually succeed. Someone can claim they don't care, then suddenly become obsessed with knowing what you're doing. Someone can tell you they've moved on, then somehow bring your name into every conversation. The mouth says one thing, the body often tells another story, and you started noticing those little contradictions. Not because you became paranoid, but because you became observant. There's a difference. Paranoia looks for enemies everywhere. Awareness simply notices patterns. You weren't interested in inventing problems. You were interested in understanding reality. If someone consistently treated you differently whenever other people were around, you noticed. If someone became supportive only after your success became visible, you noticed. If someone suddenly became competitive after realizing you were improving, you noticed. You didn't need to confront them every time. Sometimes the reaction itself was enough information. The funniest part is that people often expose themselves when they try hardest to hide something. They over-explain, they laugh too loudly, they become defensive before anyone even accused them. They suddenly need everyone to know how little they care. They start telling you what they would never do while quietly doing exactly that. They create unnecessary stories to make simple things look complicated. They think they're protecting their image, but they're actually drawing attention to the exact place they want nobody to look. You learn not to chase those moments. You let them happen, because the moment you react emotionally, the focus shifts away from what they revealed and toward how you responded. That's what they expect. They want you angry because anger makes the conversation easier to control. They want you defensive because then you start explaining yourself. They want you distracted because distracted people stop observing. So you stop giving them the reaction they were waiting for. You became comfortable with letting people misunderstand you. That was difficult at first. Everyone wants to be understood. Everyone wants to correct the false story. Everyone wants to scream, "That's not what happened." But eventually you realized something uncomfortable. Some people aren't confused about you. They simply prefer their version of you because it protects their ego. Give them the truth and they'll argue. Give them evidence and they'll change the subject. Give them silence and suddenly they have to sit alone with whatever they already know. Your restraint became a mirror. People started revealing themselves because you stopped interrupting them. You let them finish the sentence. You let them tell the story. You let them explain why they did what they did. And sometimes the more they talked, the less believable their story became. Not because you challenged them, but because they kept adding details nobody asked for. They were trying to convince you while accidentally convincing themselves. That's why you started trusting behavior more than promises. Words can be edited. Behavior repeats. Someone can apologize beautifully and still repeat the same disrespect a week later. Someone can call themselves loyal and disappear the moment loyalty becomes inconvenient. Someone can claim they want you to succeed and then become strangely cold when you actually start winning. You don't have to expose them. You don't have to punish them. Just notice the pattern and adjust your expectations. Because once you see a pattern, you can't unsee it. The person you once trusted blindly suddenly looks different. The friend you thought was supportive starts revealing conditions you never knew existed. The competitor you never considered suddenly becomes obsessed with proving they're better. And sometimes the person who seemed completely indifferent starts reacting to your every move. That's when you understand that attention doesn't always look like admiration. Sometimes it looks like criticism. Sometimes it looks like imitation. Sometimes it looks like unnecessary competition. And you stop taking every reaction personally. That was another level of freedom. Someone's discomfort with your growth doesn't automatically mean you did something wrong. Someone's jealousy doesn't become your responsibility just because you noticed it. Someone else's insecurity doesn't require you to shrink so they can feel comfortable. You can acknowledge what you see without becoming consumed by it. They thought they were hiding their feelings, but their behavior kept betraying them. Every unnecessary comparison, every sudden change in attitude, every attempt to minimize your progress, every strange silence after good news, every exaggerated reaction to something that supposedly didn't matter. They were giving you information without realizing it. And you became quieter because you finally understood that information is more valuable when you don't immediately announce that you have it. You didn't need to expose every person who revealed themselves. You didn't need to turn every observation into a confrontation. Sometimes the smartest response is simply changing how much access someone has to you. Less information, less explanation, less emotional investment, less opportunity for them to pull you back into the same cycle. They kept thinking you were unaware because you weren't reacting, but you were simply learning to separate what people said from what their behavior actually meant. Watching the hesitation, the jealousy, the sudden confidence, the forced laughter, the defensive explanations, the moments when their carefully constructed image slipped for just a second, giving you a clearer picture than any confession ever could. And while they were still trying to control what you believed about them, you were quietly deciding what you believed about them based on everything they had already shown you. They know more than they admit. That's the strange part. You can almost see it in the way they suddenly become confused whenever the conversation gets too close to the truth. They ask questions they already know the answers to. They pretend they didn't notice what happened. They act surprised when the pieces start connecting. It's almost impressive, really, watching someone perform ignorance with such confidence. But you stopped falling for it. You realize that sometimes, "I don't know," doesn't mean someone is clueless. Sometimes it means they know exactly what happened and simply don't want to be responsible for admitting that they saw it coming. People play dumb when the truth threatens the story they've been telling themselves. They need the story because it protects their ego. Maybe they believe they were always in control. Maybe they believe you were never capable of doing what you did. Maybe they convinced themselves your progress was temporary, your discipline was luck, your silence meant weakness, and your patience meant you had nothing better to do. Then reality showed up and ruined the comfortable little narrative they had built. Suddenly, they had to explain why the person they underestimated kept moving forward while they remained trapped in the same patterns. So they pretend not to understand. They act like your transformation came out of nowhere. They ask when you became so disciplined. They wonder why you stopped reacting. They question why you don't seek their approval anymore. They act shocked that you can walk away from situations that once consumed you. But there was no mystery. You simply stopped feeding the things that were draining you. You stopped arguing with people who enjoyed arguments. You stopped explaining decisions to people who had already decided they were wrong. You stopped giving unlimited access to people who treated your attention like something they were entitled to. And that change exposed something uncomfortable. When you stop participating in the old version of yourself, everyone who benefited from that version notices. Some people will celebrate your growth. Others will become confused by it. A few will quietly resent it. Not because you harmed them, but because your growth removes the version of you they knew how to control. The moment you stop responding the way they expect, their old strategies become useless. That's why they play dumb. They're hoping you'll explain everything again. They want you to fill in the blanks for them. They want you to say what you noticed, what you understood, what you figured out. Because once you explain what you know, they know exactly what you know. And suddenly the mystery disappears. So you let them wonder. Let them wonder why you became quieter. Let them wonder why you stopped sharing everything. Let them wonder why you don't react to the same provocations anymore. Let them wonder why their words no longer have the power they once had. You don't owe everyone a detailed explanation of your evolution. Sometimes people only understand your boundaries after they lose access to you. They only understand your value after your absence becomes noticeable. They only recognize how much energy you were giving when you stopped giving it. And that realization can make people uncomfortable because it forces them to reconsider the way they treated you when they thought you would always be available. They'll say, You changed. Of course you changed. That's what growth does. The funny thing is, they usually don't complain about the person you became. They complain because you stopped being the person they could predict. They miss the version of you that explained yourself too much. The version that gave second chances without limits. The version that felt guilty for protecting personal boundaries. The version that would immediately respond to every accusation. They call your new behavior cold because your old behavior gave them unlimited access to your emotions. But you're not cold. You're selective. There's a difference. You learn that peace becomes expensive when you keep giving it away to people who create chaos. You learn that not every battle deserves your energy. You learn that proving your innocence to someone committed to misunderstanding you is a losing game. And once you understood that, their little performances became easier to see. They can pretend not to know. They can pretend they didn't notice. They can pretend your success surprised them. They can pretend they never doubted you. They can even rewrite the history of how they treated you. Let them. You don't need to fight every rewritten story. Reality has a habit of keeping receipts without making a sound. The results speak. The patterns speak. The distance speaks. Your life speaks. And the more you improve, the harder it becomes for them to maintain the old story. Because eventually they have to face the uncomfortable possibility that you were never as powerless as they believed. Maybe you weren't lost. Maybe you were learning. Maybe you weren't failing. Maybe you were rebuilding. Maybe you weren't silent because you had nothing to say. Maybe you were silent because you finally understood that announcing every move gives everyone else permission to interfere. That's the truth they don't want to admit. You didn't suddenly become capable. You became consistent. You didn't suddenly become strong. You stopped negotiating with your weaknesses. You didn't suddenly become difficult to control. You simply stopped volunteering for control. And now they're standing there pretending they have no idea how you got here, while quietly remembering every moment they underestimated you. Every time they dismissed your potential. Every time they assumed you would remain the same. Every time they mistook patience for weakness and silence for surrender. And somewhere beneath all that pretending is the uncomfortable realization that you were paying attention long before they realized you were watching. Long before they understood that the person they treated like background noise was quietly becoming impossible to ignore, quietly becoming harder to manipulate, quietly becoming someone who no longer needed them to understand what was happening in order to keep moving forward. There's a moment when you realize control was never about controlling people, it was about controlling yourself. Funny how long it takes to understand something so simple. You spent years thinking you needed to make people understand you, respect you, agree with you, or finally admit that you were right. You thought winning meant having the last word. Then you discovered something far more useful. You don't need to control the conversation when you can control your response. You don't need to control people when you can control your direction. And you certainly don't need to control every outcome when you can control what you do next. That was the moment everything became different. You stopped chasing reactions and started creating results. Instead of asking, how do I make them see my value? You started asking, what can I build while they're busy watching? Instead of trying to force respect, you started becoming undeniable through consistency. Instead of demanding opportunities, you started developing the kind of discipline that created your own. You stopped trying to move every piece on the board and started improving your position. Suddenly, you weren't reacting to the game anymore. You were building a life that didn't require permission from the people who once made you question yourself. People love the illusion of control. They think if they can predict your emotions, they can predict your decisions. If they know what makes you angry, they can push you. If they know what makes you insecure, they can distract you. If they know what you desperately want, they can make you chase it. That's why emotional discipline changes everything. The moment you stop allowing someone else's behavior to dictate your next move, they lose a certain kind of power over you. They can still talk. They can still criticize. They can still misunderstand you. But they can no longer decide what happens inside your head. And that is where your freedom begins. Not when everyone agrees with you. Not when everyone apologizes. Not when every unfair situation suddenly becomes fair. It begins when you stop waiting for the outside world to become peaceful before you become peaceful. You stop saying, "I'll focus when they stop distracting me." You stop saying, "I'll move forward when they understand." You stop saying, "I'll be confident when they finally recognize what I'm capable of." No, you realize that if your progress depends on everyone else behaving correctly, you have already handed them the steering wheel, so you took it back. You started making decisions based on your values instead of other people's reactions. You started choosing discipline when motivation disappeared. You started choosing distance when conversations became pointless. You started choosing patience when rushing would have created problems. You started choosing silence when speaking would only feed the chaos. None of this looked dramatic from the outside. That's the funny part. Real change rarely announces itself with fireworks. Sometimes it looks like waking up and doing the work when nobody is watching. Sometimes it looks like refusing to send the angry message. Sometimes it looks like closing the door quietly instead of slamming it. They might not notice those moments, but you do. And eventually those small decisions begin producing outcomes that even they can't ignore. Your confidence becomes stronger because you kept promises to yourself. Your focus becomes sharper because you stopped wasting energy on unnecessary battles. Your standards rise because you finally realize that access to you should mean something. Your life becomes quieter because you stopped inviting chaos just to prove you could survive it. That's when people start asking what happened to you. Nothing happened to you. You happened to yourself. You finally became responsible for the direction of your life. You stopped blaming every obstacle. You stopped waiting for someone else to rescue your potential. You stopped treating your circumstances like a permanent sentence. You started looking at problems as information. If something wasn't working, you adjusted. If someone crossed a boundary, you created distance. If a plan failed, you learned. If you made a mistake, you corrected it. You stopped needing every failure to have a villain, because sometimes the lesson was simply that your strategy needed to change. That mindset is difficult for people to understand, because it removes excuses. If you control your response, then you have responsibility. If you control your habits, then you have responsibility. If you control your effort, your attention, your standards, and your direction, then you can no longer blame everyone else for where you end up. And that can be terrifying. But it can also be liberating. You don't need to manipulate the room when you can master yourself. You don't need to force people to respect you when you can build a life that reflects your standards. You don't need to chase every opportunity when you can become the kind of person prepared to recognize the right one. You don't need to make everyone regret underestimating you. Let them keep their opinions. Your job is not to manage their imagination. Your job is to manage your reality. That's why your silence became different. Before, you were silent because you were trying not to react. Now, you're silent because you're busy creating. There's a massive difference. One comes from restraint. The other comes from direction. You aren't sitting around waiting for people to make their next move. You're building your own next move. You're improving your skills, protecting your time, strengthening your habits, and making decisions that your future self will thank you for. And the more you do that, the less interested you become in proving anything. Proving becomes exhausting when creating becomes addictive. You stop asking who noticed. You stop checking who approved. You stop wondering whether someone finally understands. You start measuring yourself against who you were yesterday, against the promises you made to yourself, against the standards you said you would live by. They may still think you're trying to control everything. Let them think it. You're not controlling everything. You're controlling what belongs to you. Your attention, your discipline, your choices, your boundaries, your reactions, your effort, and the direction you take after every setback. While they're busy trying to predict your next move, you're building something they can't influence simply by talking about it, something created quietly through repetition, patience, and decisions nobody applauded. until one day the outcome becomes so obvious that the explanations stop mattering, and the only thing left is the life you built while everyone else was still trying to figure out how to control the version of you that no longer exists. There's always a moment when the room gets quiet. Not because somebody told it to be quiet, but because people suddenly realize the story they were telling themselves doesn't make sense anymore. They look back at everything that happened, and pieces that once seemed random start connecting. The decisions you made, the things you didn't say, the opportunities you walked away from, the moments when you refused to react. Suddenly, they begin seeing a pattern. And that's when the uncomfortable thought appears. Maybe you weren't lost at all. Maybe you were simply moving differently. They thought you were reacting to life. They didn't realize you were preparing for it. While they were busy responding to every little problem, you were learning how to anticipate the next one. While they were arguing about what happened yesterday, you were thinking about what needed to happen tomorrow. While they were trying to prove who was right, you were trying to understand what actually worked. That difference may not look impressive in the beginning. In fact, it can look boring, but boring becomes powerful when it is repeated long enough to create results. You didn't need to know everything. You just needed to pay attention. You watched what worked and what failed. You noticed which habits kept people stuck and which habits helped people move forward. You noticed how quickly emotions could destroy a good decision. You noticed how often people sacrificed long-term progress just to feel powerful for 5 minutes. And instead of copying them, you started doing something much less exciting. You started thinking before acting. That made you unpredictable to people who were used to getting instant reactions from you. They expected anger, but you gave them distance. They expected an argument, but you gave them silence. They expected you to chase after something, but you walked away. They expected you to explain yourself, but you let your results speak. They thought these were random decisions because they couldn't see the bigger picture you were building. And that's the thing about being 3 moves ahead. You don't need to announce it. In fact, announcing it usually ruins it. The person who constantly tells everyone what they're planning is often giving away the advantage before the work even begins. You learn to keep certain goals private, not because you were afraid of criticism, but because you finally understood that not everyone deserves a front row seat to your unfinished life. Some people only understand success after it becomes visible. Before that, they call it unrealistic. They call you obsessed. They tell you to relax. They question why you're working so hard. Then the results arrive and suddenly the story changes. Suddenly they say they always knew you could do it. Suddenly they remember encouraging you. Suddenly your discipline becomes luck. Because admitting that you built it through thousands of ordinary decisions would force them to look at their own choices. You don't need to correct them. Let them rewrite the story if they need to. You know what happened. You remember the mornings nobody saw, the nights when you wanted to quit but continued anyway, the decisions that looked insignificant at the time but changed your direction later, the times you chose patience instead of impulse, the moments you stayed quiet because you knew reacting would only create another problem. Those were the moves they never saw, and now they're trying to understand the outcome by looking only at the ending. That's like watching the last 5 minutes of a movie and pretending you understand the entire plot. They see where you are now, but they didn't see what it cost to get there. They didn't see the mistakes you corrected. They didn't see the habits you destroyed. They didn't see the distractions you removed. They didn't see the version of you that had to disappear so this one could exist. That's why their confusion is almost predictable. They're searching for one dramatic moment that explains everything. There wasn't one. You became different through repetition. You became stronger through uncomfortable choices. You became sharper through mistakes. You became calmer by realizing that not every situation deserved your emotional energy. 3 moves ahead doesn't mean you predicted every detail. It means you stopped needing everything to go perfectly. You developed enough awareness to adjust when things changed. If one door closed, you looked for another route. If someone betrayed your trust, you learned instead of collapsing. If a plan failed, you changed the plan without changing your belief in yourself. That's real strategic thinking. Not pretending you control everything, but being prepared to respond intelligently when you don't. And that's what makes your progress difficult for people to understand. They expected you to need perfect circumstances. Instead, you learned to create progress inside imperfect ones. They expected setbacks to stop you. You used them as information. They expected criticism to weaken you. You used it to become more selective. They expected rejection to make you desperate. You used it to become more patient eventually. People start noticing that you don't move like you used to. You don't rush toward every opportunity. You don't chase every person. You don't argue with every opinion. You don't reveal every plan. You don't panic when something changes. You pause, observe, adjust, and move again. That pause is what they misunderstood. They thought hesitation meant uncertainty. Sometimes it means calculation. Sometimes it means discipline. Sometimes it means you're refusing to make a permanent decision based on a temporary emotion. And when you finally move, they wonder where that decision came from, because they didn't see the thinking that happened before it. They were watching your actions. You were building the reasons behind them. They were counting the moves they could see. You were preparing the ones they couldn't. That's why the realization hits differently when it finally arrives. They understand that the person they underestimated wasn't waiting for permission, wasn't desperately trying to prove anything, and wasn't randomly stumbling into success. You were learning, adapting, removing distractions, protecting your focus, and quietly becoming someone who could make better decisions under pressure. Someone who didn't need to know exactly what tomorrow would bring, because you had finally learned how to handle whatever tomorrow brought. While they were still trying to understand the last move you made, you were already thinking about what comes after that.